The guillotine is amongst the most iconic and chilling instruments of execution in human history. Introduced during the French Revolution as a supposedly humane and egalitarian mean of death, it became both a symbol of justice and terror. Whilst much has been written about the condemned, less attention is paid to the spectators, the crowds who gathered in public squares, the vendors who sold refreshments, the children perched on their fathers' shoulders, and the journalists scribbling their notes in their pads. To witness a guillotine execution was to take part in a ritual that was once political theatre, morbid fascination, and also public warning. In this video we explore the psychological experience of watching a guillotine execution, focusing particularly on revolutionary France, though later touching on its use in the 19th and 20th century. We look at the atmosphere of the crowd, the role of the executioner, the behaviour of the condemned, and the emotional impact on the bystanders. From the earliest days of the French Revolution, the guillotine was a public spectacle. Its first official use was on the 25th of April 1792, when highwayman Nicolas Jacques Pelletier was executed on the Place de Grève in Paris. The machine's swift efficiency surprised and disappointed many in the crowd. They expected a prolonged, dramatic event, like a hanging or breaking on the wheel. Yet even in its abruptness, the guillotine held a macabre allure. Executions were often held in major city squares, most famously the Place de la Révolution, now the Place de la Concorde, where Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were beheaded. Temporary scaffolds were built, the guillotine placed on a raised platform so all could see. Crowds would begin to form early, sometimes hours before the execution. People brought stools, food, even telescopes. People sold pamphlets detailing the crimes of the condemned, whilst others sang songs mocking the soon-to-be executed. To many, witnessing a guillotine execution was part entertainment, part civic duty. One observer, the British traveller Arthur Young, remarked in his journal how Parisians treated executions like a fete, noting the indifference with which even children and women watched heads fall. For some it was a lesson in justice, for others an exhilarating brush with death. The psychology of the crowd at a guillotine execution could shift dramatically depending on the political climate. During the early revolution, executions were often framed as justice served, particularly when aristocrats or traitors were the ones condemned. The masses, many of them deeply radicalised by Jacobin propaganda, would shout slogans like "Vive la République" as the blade fell. The crowd fed off the collective sense of righteousness, sometimes bordering on bloodlust. However, as the reign of terror escalated between the years 1793 and 1794, the mood became more conflicted. With the execution of once revolutionary leaders like Georges Danton and Robespierre, and the mounting number of anonymous victims, some spectators began to express fatigue, even revulsion. Madame Roland, a Girondin intellectual who was executed in 1793, reportedly exclaimed before her death, "O liberty, what crimes are committed in thy name?" For those who watched her die, it may have marked a turning point, a realisation that the revolution was devouring its own. Still others never tired of the spectacle. An infamous group of women, known as the female knitters, became a staple at executions, seated near the scaffold and calmly knitting as heads rolled. They were both feared and mythologised, their presence a reminder of how normalised the violence had become. To witness a guillotine execution was also to witness a finely tuned ritual. The executioner, often from the Sanson family, who served as official executioners of Paris for generations, was both a technician and a public servant. Clad in a dark frock coat, he would oversee the construction of the scaffold, test the mechanism, and manage a team of assistants. The condemned would be transported to the scaffold in a tumbrel cart, often with hands bound and a priest by their side. Crowds jeered or cheered as they passed, depending on their reputation. Upon arrival, the prisoner's collar was removed, hair clipped if necessary, and clothing loosened. In later designs of the guillotine, a lunette, a wooden device that opened and closed around the neck, replaced the need for manual restraint. Once secured, the blade was released with a dramatic clack, descending at lightning speed. The head dropped into a basket, whilst blood spurted onto the scaffold. An executioner might hold up the severed head for the crowd to see, especially if the execution was politically charged. The head of Charlotte Corday, who assassinated Marat, was reportedly slapped by the executioner's assistant, and witnesses claimed her face reddened with indignation. The entire event, from the prison gates to the falling blade, often lasted only minutes. But to the crowd, it was an adrenaline-charged experience they would remember for years. Contemporary eyewitness accounts help reconstruct the sensory overload of the guillotine. One French writer, Georges Duval, described a summer day in 1794 attending a mass execution at the Barrière du Trône. He recalled, "The heads fell like ripe fruit. The crowd surged forward, some vomiting, others laughing. The smell of blood and hot iron hung in the air." The guillotine itself made a distinctive metallic noise, a combination of sliding wood, the drop of the blade, and a thud of severed heads hitting the basket. The sound was unmistakable, and some claim they could hear it from blocks away. The smell was equally unforgettable. With dozens executed in a day, the scaffold often became soaked in blood. In the height of summer, it stank of iron, sweat, and rot. Flies gathered in swarms. One Parisian priest wrote of the passing by the scaffold and gagging from the stench. For children or first-time spectators, the experience could be traumatic. Records from the early 19th century suggest that doctors treated patients, especially women, for fainting spells or hysteria following executions. Yet others became addicted to the sight. The French author Stendhal observed that certain people followed executions with a kind of glee, as if the loss of another head might somehow relieve the pressure of their own. While some became desensitized to the spectacle, others experienced profound emotional reaction. For revolutionaries, the guillotine was a moral necessity, a tool to protect the new republic. To see it in action was to feel a sense of historical participation, of justice moving forward. But for royalists, moderates, or families of the condemned, the experience could be harrowing. One of the most poignant accounts comes from the execution of Queen Marie Antoinette on October 16, 1793. Though many had once hated her, by the time of her own death, sympathy had grown. She was carted through the streets in a tattered chemise, hair roughly cut, and posture defiant. Witnesses described the silence that fell as she stepped onto the scaffold. When her head fell, there was no cheer, only stunned quiet, followed by murmurs of disquiet. Later, during Napoleon's reign, and even into the 20th century, the guillotine continued to function, though executions became more private. Yet in the provinces, crowds still gathered. During the execution of the infamous serial killer, Henri Désiré Landru, in 1922, some 300 people attended, though by then public executions were increasingly criticised as barbaric. The emotional experience for many came with guilt. As the philosopher Michel Foucault argued, public executions were not just punishments, but displays of state power, and those who watched became complicit in that power. This psychological weight lingered in many memoirs and diaries of the period. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the guillotine was increasingly viewed through the lens of horror, not justice. Writers like Victor Hugo campaigned against capital punishment, and his fictional depictions of the condemned humanized them in ways the revolution never had. Yet fascination persisted. Execution days remained events. In 1939, the last public guillotine execution in France took place in Marseille, the beheading of murderer Eugene Weidmann. The crowd was so unruly, and journalists so sensational in their coverage, that the French government finally banned public executions altogether. Film cameras had captured the moment. It was one of the first times that death by guillotine had been preserved on film, and it disturbed many viewers. For the first time, the modern world saw what the previous generations had watched live and recoiled. The distance between state violence and public entertainment had narrowed uncomfortably. Even today, the idea of watching a guillotine execution provokes complex reaction, part curiosity, part horror. Museums across France display their devices, and documentaries revisit their history. But to understand what it was like to witness one, we must grasp both the sensory immediacy and political theatre that surrounded each act. To witness a guillotine execution was to stand at the crossroads of justice and death, performance and punishment, spectacle and trauma. It was not simply an act of killing, but a ritual soaked in symbolism. The crowd played a role, as did the condemned, the executioner, and the blade itself, a silent gleaming judge. In revolutionary France, a guillotine represented equality. All from kings to commoners could lose their heads in the same way. But equality did not mean dignity, and for many who watched, especially as the blade fell on friends, loved ones, or political allies, the experience became one of horror, not triumph. Ultimately, the legacy of the guillotine is not just the blood it spilled, but the spectators it shaped, citizens forged in the crucible of terror, hardened by the thud of falling heads, and haunted by the images they could never unsee. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.